All right, we're at 50. So we will get started because it's 5:05 and we're at 50 people. So all the things are lining up for us. All right, so I'm Earl Doobie. I'm the president of the CSA Detroit chapter, and thank you for the 50 of you that have shown up, and hopefully many more are coming in as we get here. But it's Tuesday, first Tuesday of the month, which, as I always say, the first Tuesday of the month is CSA Tuesday. So that's today. And for those of you who have not voted, I guess it's probably too late. But if you get a chance, go vote. So here we have our board. And many of you have seen this board before, but I'm very proud of this board. It's I'd say it's the best board in the area here. So, and we're going to have some open spots. So stay tuned to that, and you can volunteer and be on this great board as well. So tonight we are joined by GuidePoint, and they're going to have a nice discussion for us about cloud security, because that's why we're all here. And that's what we're here to learn about. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris from GuidePoint, who will introduce himself and talk about what's coming ahead.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Earl. So my name is Chris Rantz. I'm one of the account executives here in Michigan for GuidePoint. Today, I want to introduce Ramki Dahan. Ramki is a principal consultant at GuidePoint on our cloud security team. Ramki has over 22 years of experience as a technical and business leader and a technology strategist. Ramki's worked with commercial corporations such as Microsoft, Razorfish, Kohl's, as well as federal agencies, including the General Services Administration, the EPA, and the TSA. So Ramki, I'll let you introduce yourself too. Up, you're stuck on mute, Ramki.
Sounds good. I was gonna say, is this a moment where I can share my screen? Is that cool?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, there we go. Yeah, so my name is Ramki Dahan. I come actually very close, where I live, very close to y'all in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So apologize for any sports conflicts that induce, but I'm not really a sports person, so it's fine. I do work at GuidePoint under the cloud security team. More specifically, kind of been helping on the SaaS security side over the last 2.5 years. As Chris mentioned, I worked previously with an organization called 18F. And so this was the digital transformation arm of the federal government. So modernizing agencies into the cloud and into modern technologies, and practicing things like human-centered design to improve experiences for citizens across the US. I'm a father of 4. Little fun tidbit. Another fun tidbit is I'm also a DJ. So I've DJed all over the world in different countries and all over the US. So I want to start off with any situation in a story. So we were on a call with a customer doing a SaaS security audit of a very particular platform. And during that call, the CISO and the entire security team was on the call. And the CISO interrupted and said, "We don't have to worry about the security of the platform. It's already covered by the vendor." And I took a deep breath and just politely kind of discussed the potential security risks that this platform would have, and the potential things that I've seen in the many years that I've been doing this around SaaS, and how someone could intrude into the environment, and essentially breaking down what their responsibility was. And so by the end of that conversation, he said, "I'm sorry, that is correct. We do need a SaaS security strategy." And so, what I'm hopefully going to talk about today is really that, what is the importance of having a very specific SaaS security strategy? What type of techniques and tools are out there to be able to, apply a program that is going to be sophisticated, that is going to be addressing essentially the needs of the security team and the protection of the organization, and what are some of the things that are going on in this moment to be able to look at, as far as the maturity of SaaS security overall. And so really, to break this down more specifically, defining SaaS, what is the definition, understanding the shared responsibility model in particular with SaaS, and really understanding it, understanding impact. What does that mean as far as SaaS when you have an impact model in your organization, managing a SaaS portfolio, and more specifically with a tiered security model, onboarding SaaS platforms. I saw this is kind of what I've seen in the industry as, when we've probably done a dozen or so security reviews of SaaS programs and organizations, and really what I've seen is the onboarding is such a critical piece. So I wanted to touch on that, and then the second piece is really the security posture management. So what are we doing in this space, and then some tips and tricks, or basically stories that I've heard as well. And so, referring back to, actually, before I get started, if there's any questions that anyone has, feel free to throw them in the chat. Let me just launch my chat window real quick just to make sure that that's there. Or feel free to jump in, and I'm happy to answer any of those. But I always think it's good to look at the definitions of cloud and the definitions of the different delivery methods, and SaaS is one of those that in the NIST 800 145 that I think are really important. A lot of times when an organization is looking at a platform, they're not really sure what it is, and really the lines between SaaS and PaaS are probably more blurred than anywhere else. And another positioning that gets confusing is, what type of software is it actually a SaaS platform, or is it just a software that I'm installing on-prem or something? That tends to be a confusion point for a lot of organizations as well, as we've noticed. But I think one of the important things to call out during this definition is that it's running on cloud infrastructure. And that it's not just necessarily a web browser that you're accessing the SaaS platform, but a program interface, and really the key point is that the consumer doesn't manage any of the underlying cloud infrastructure, network servers, operating system storage, et cetera. But really they have user-specific application configuration settings. And so I think that's a really important definition to have, because it gives you kind of the constant check. And as SaaS is developing and maturing, some of those lines get blurred. You might have a SaaS platform that is specifically looking at infrastructure, which gets a little confusing to an organization, because it's not a SaaS provider in the business, on the business side, but on the infrastructure side. And so it gets complicated. And the more you can kind of refer back to the definition, I think the easier it is to kind of look at that insight. Oh, there you go. So the shared responsibility model, I'm sure everyone has seen this, over the time of cloud. This is something that's really been around. But I think what I wanted to do is really kind of understand it, especially on the SaaS side. It's really kind of easy to understand on the IaaS and the PaaS side, on where you own the piece of your management. But on SaaS, it gets confusing. And the reason why it gets confusing is because there's really no standard. As much as this illustrates that, SaaS is really looking at identity and access, client and endpoint protection, and data classification accountability, sometimes certain SaaS platforms will dip into different areas. And sometimes the mix and the overlap of those responsibilities, meaning that I may have a configuration setting in my SaaS platform where I can change essentially identity and access, but that may introduce something new that I didn't necessarily think about. And I'll go through a couple examples as we go forward. One thing, since we are talking about CSA, one thing that I always appreciate and share with customers is really the control settings, as far as the type of control and ownership, applicability and ownership in the CSA CCM framework. And really, I think a lot of, if you look at like something like high trust, and a lot of other controls, they're starting to kind of adopt this control setting, this ownership setting, to help the individuals that are in a SaaS or they're in a security initiative to understand, well, who owns what. If you ever looked at the high trust one, it's really confusing because it doesn't really mention who owns what. It's kind of inherited, but inherited by who. Where I think the CSA one is a little bit more easy to understand. Is it CSC owned, meaning the customer owns that responsibility, or CSP owned, meaning the cloud service provider owns that responsibility or shared. And when you're going through kind of your security audits, it's really nice to kind of say, well, okay, this control that I'm working with to review this platform, I can clearly define what that is. And this is such an important piece, I think, in the SaaS ecosystem that's starting to get a little bit more maturity. In version 3, they didn't necessarily have this. And so this kind of just illustrates, our understanding as we're moving forward. But one thing that I kind of want to iterate between elaborate between each of these sections is really when it's CSC owned, is understanding the configurations owned by you. It seems to be a big problem in the industry. Organizations really don't understand all the configurations that are owned by them and what type of responsibility they have in that ownership. I always use encryption as an example because encryption sometimes is something you need to purchase from the CSP. So for example, Oracle HSM, which is a human resources platform, to have encryption, you actually have to purchase it, right? And so it's kind of owned by you, that you have to understand the responsibility, but it's managed by the CSP. So it gets a little confusing on what exactly do you own from that responsibility. Where on the CSP owned side, the perspective is validating the security posture. It's one thing to send out your questionnaire and get it answered. It's another thing to kind of validate, that actual configuration is in place. And it goes a little further than just having, your SOC certificate. And I'll give some examples of some of the architecture decisions that are made in cloud-based applications that can cause an organization to take pause and essentially determine, am I going to continue with this application, or am I going to force the cloud service provider to be able to. I'm sorry, did you say something? Just a quick note, if someone is talking, if you could be put on mute, that would be great. Thanks. So for CSP owned, just being able to ask cloud-specific security questions, so you know that that control is specifically, addressing a cloud-specific issue and it's secure. And then shared, understanding how it's shared. So just using the encryption example, knowing for Oracle, knowing that, I have to purchase it. And essentially it could be for encryption, I bring my own key or they handle the key. And so I don't necessarily have to have responsibility of that management. It's handled by the SaaS platform. Any questions on that before I move on?
Really quick, Ramki, thank you so much for saying that. It appears our chat is not working properly. So if anybody does have a question, please maybe raise your hand. I'm not sure if that is even a function here, but if not, I'm assuming when you pause, people can unmute themselves and ask the question, because for some reason the chat is not working, and I apologize for that. I don't know, Rob, if you can fix that. Thank you.
No worries. And if you want to interrupt me, it's perfectly fine. I will not take offense. So that's really, I think, a big part of just understanding the shared responsibility model when it comes to SaaS, understanding these kind of the aspects of what you own, what is owned by the cloud service provider and what is shared, and really trying to understand it, digging into their materials that they have. Sometimes it's looking at the documentation of their developer documentation to kind of dig into it. Platforms like ServiceNow and Salesforce get really complicated, and they do quarterly releases on their updates. And so if you're not on top of that, you can really kind of pay the price if you're not paying attention. This next aspect is understanding impact. And I really enjoy the NIST FIPS 199 publication around impact and how this relates to SaaS. A lot of times organizations have a large portfolio of applications, and not every single application is of high security, right? You may have a public-facing SaaS-based application that's not storing any data. You may have something a little bit more moderate, maybe the storing customer information, but nothing from a PII perspective. Or you may have high, where you're storing more confidential information, maybe some PII, maybe you have to adhere to a standard, and it's falling to that process. But really, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that in the SaaS world, organizations aren't necessarily applying this type of thinking inside of their SaaS-based applications. And when they do have a breach, or they have something where the SaaS provider is not available, which also is very common, right? That can cause a disruption, either a limited, a serious, or severe. And so understanding the impact of what that SaaS platform has in your organization can be really critical. And so what I like to do is combine essentially the things that I've kind of ran through is the shared responsibility model, the impact classification, and then the last part, which a lot of organizations already have, is data classification, right? And so taking all that information and putting it in a tiered security model, because because as I mentioned before, you have all these different tiers and levels of security, or I'm sorry, of classification in your organization, you can tier the security based on that. And this is something that I've taken from FedRamp. I don't know if you're familiar with the FedRamp program in the federal government, but their stance is that, you can have an organization essentially fit the budget you can have an organization that fits the budget of your security program, so you're not spending so much on platforms that aren't necessarily in the higher tiers of security. And so, I'm sorry, in the lower tiers of security. So for a lower tier security program, you can limit that budget. FedRamp used to have a really good illustration of like a car and a bike, and they say, well, the way you secure your car is a lot more stringent than what you would do to secure a bike. And so what we try to do with that is really implement the SaaS platform so that, it's kind of easier to fit with that with the scale of the organization. And what we've noticed is, some SaaS organizations, we just dealt with one that had 14,000 some organizations had 14,000 SaaS-based applications running in their portfolio. And so imagine trying to manage and look at the different levels of security with 14,000 applications. It becomes unmanageable. There's not enough, resources dedicated to audit all those platforms or run a security, program to get it up to speed. And so having a tiered security model kind of provides you a really good look at being able to do that. So I wanted to give a quick example. Stanford University has their tiered security model actually available online. This is nothing I worked on, but I always use this as kind of a good example of what's happening in the industry in different places, and something that you can see that's public that is really helpful. And so they walk through, like if you go through their website, you can actually see they have a pretty detailed process on product selection, pre-implementation planning, inventory, and asset classification. But then after that, it's really just looking at the different domains and being able to say if it's a high risk application, there's certain things that we require. But if it's low risk, as you can see, there's less things that are required for that SaaS-based application. And you're able to kind of drill down and look at these different sections and just to kind of expand and look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. Things like encryption, right? So encryption is required across all three. We have to enable, TLS 1.2 or higher, or use encryption at data at rest if available. But if it's a lower tier application, two-factor authentication is necessarily doesn't have to be enabled for that. Where something like logging and auditing and data management have to be available for the mid to higher tier initiatives. And so I think this is kind of a really good example of a program that has been efficient. I'm sorry, was somebody gonna ask a question? It's gonna be me interrupting on like hearing little noises. So yeah, so that's kind of that for that aspect. I don't know if anybody has any questions on that. Maybe I'll pause for a second.
Come on, somebody ask a question. He's dying to answer a question.
I'll take a question, any question.
Hey, Ramki. Hey, it's Bill. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks for the presentation. Could you maybe touch on this process and maybe how it relates to CASB? I've read a lot about CASB, been around some different vendors, solutions in that space. And there's sort of like a little bit of divergence in terms of accessing SaaS platforms and securing the methodology and process of how you access them, and then separately sort of what data or information you're actually using and storing in the cloud. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I believe so. So essentially, like how is are you asking more how is the CASB being utilized in this methodology with the platforms?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that there's really I haven't yet seen an organization that has really adopted a very mature process for it yet. I feel like organizations are just starting to get CASBs in place and starting to kind of really figure out, well, what are we looking at, you know? So it's more of the discovery phase of like, what are the types of things that the data that we get back from the CASB, and then starting to lock down some of the more higher level confidential things, right? Things like social security number or banking information. Seems to be kind of like the quick things that they can look at to like solidify from a data standpoint. Is this data being copied into the right platform?
Right.
The other aspect of that from the CASB perspective is the use of authorized versus unauthorized platforms, and really authorized platforms of the right instance, which I'll give some examples to a little bit later. But I think from just kind of a standards perspective, like people are just starting to kind of understand it and figure out how this kind of applies to the organization from that perspective. Most of the groups that I've interfaced with, which has probably been over a couple dozen, are just getting out of their beta phase of CASB, which is real interesting. Somebody had their hand raised. I can't see their name though.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. Really interesting example from Stanford. I've worked with them before. I work in higher education, and so I'm very familiar with their work. I'm wondering, and so I only know really about what's being done in higher education. Are there examples outside of higher education where things like this are being done, or is this sort of the best example that's out there?
It's the most public example that I've seen.
That's super fair, because obviously higher ed shares things widely. Thank you.
I mean, and government uses FedRAMP, right? And so FedRAMP is probably your like most stringent. But yes, there is organizations that are starting to adopt a multi-tier, and there's organizations that are like in their program that are starting to see the benefit of that, right? For example, if application goes from, let's say, there was an example where a customer had a data classification that was less than what it actually was. And so once they re-audited the system and realized that the data that was sitting inside the SaaS platform was of higher classification, it was easier for them to say, can we adopt the higher tier security levels and figure it out, instead of go through this like really crazy segment of running around with their heads cut off, knowing that it was out of classification, and trying to figure out what to do from there. And so because they had that process in place, it was just kind of like, okay, we'll run it through audit again, make sure it's good, implement all those security controls, or ask if they can downgrade the data. But it was kind of a quick fix for them to be able to adjust and make that determination.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hey, Ramke, real quickly, we did enable chat, so anyone that wants to send a question, feel free to. Prior to that, we did get a question. The question is, many times SOC 2 is considered as a gold standard for SaaS. What is your take on that?
Yeah. I'm going to say no, and I'll get into that in a second. with the, actually, that's a perfect transition to the next thing, which is onboarding. We have, just to kind of talk about this, like a lot of us in our team have worked for SaaS vendors, and it's not too complicated to get into the SOC 2 approval, but really what is important from a security standpoint is auditing their architecture to determine how secure their infrastructure is, and really how it applies to your organization, because SOC 2 covers a lot of great things, but as far as like the details and the nuances of their architecture, it doesn't necessarily do that. And so there's so many risks on the cloud architecture side that aren't covered in the SOC 2 experience that we really kind of push to ask really specific questions around that, just to ensure that, you know, they're managing their risk plane in the complete way in the cloud sense. Does that answer your question, or allude to more questions when I get to this? So validating your SaaS security. And so these are just a couple things that we look at that I wanted to talk about as far as quick hits around this. And some of these organizations are starting to do pretty well on, and some of these organizations are really struggling with. And so the first one is the Eula. And we've had a couple scenarios where, you know, the license agreement specifically for SaaS doesn't fit in your organization, and really specifically with the data, you know, what the organization is doing with data and what types of rights. There's been many of times, over a dozen, where we've had to get the organization to rewrite where the ownership of the data is coming from, because, you know, as a SaaS-based platform, especially if you're getting into things like machine learning, how the data is getting kind of reviewed, that could be a potential risk of being out of compliance for your organization, or in violation of how you're using the data in your own agreements. And so really kind of digging into that type of questioning in there is really important. So the vendor risk assessment, and this is part of that SOC question. And really, I try to ask the questions of how have you validated the cloud-specific architecture of the application? And it's such an important question to really look at. How is that architecture being created so that you can ensure that your instance in the tenant that you're managing is completely secure? Example being, what if your tenant is kind of in the same AWS account as other tenants, you know, and that cross-tenant architecture, you know, has certain things like keeping the same key across the data set. And so, or, you know, utilizing the same resources. Sometimes you need more privacy depending on the type of organization that you need, you need your own architecture. Your own organization in the tenant, so you are isolated from everyone else. And really, that's the important thing, as has a cloud security expert validated the vendor's security posture. So not just having your security team, but a cloud security specialist being able to look at and validate that different aspects of that. Since we're at CSA, the CSA Cloud Octagon model, which I'll give you an example of, is great for this. You know, having that cross-functional team looking at the risk of that is really important. Classification has the platform been classified for data and impact. So what I mentioned before, if you don't know what type of data is being housed in there, or you don't know what type of impact that's having in your organization, that's going to be a pretty big deal, right? And based on those classifications, has a tier been set? And so in that tier, does it pass those SaaS security requirements? So that's such an important piece. You may have a scenario where, the tier may be accepted and maybe one control is off, and that needs to be improved by the CISO or the business management team. But you pretty much want to stick to your policies around, what tier and what type of security controls are there. Point 5, tenant configuration. So this is also a big piece that a lot of people kind of oversee. And sometimes you have a service design or an architectural design team that is looking at all the interfaces that the SaaS interfaces integrates with. So if it's integrating with on-prem or integrating with another application that is local, they'll look at all the different configurations outside, but they won't look at the actual tenant configuration. And so being able to look at the tenant configuration, and does your organization really understand all those configurations that they're responsible for, or they're part of the shared responsibility? Do you understand them? And the other question of that, does it meet all the requirements, right? And so you may have a scenario, just to pick on encryption again, where you may have to buy the encryption, but you also may have to set the encryption after you purchase, or you may have to bring your own key to manage that. Point 6, I think, is really important, is third party. And so because SaaS can integrate into other SaaS platforms pretty easily, can we manage the integration add-ons of the SaaS vendor? I don't know how many scenarios I've seen where, an organization buys a SaaS platform and, they unleash it into their organization, and the organization's, people start adding different plugins and, integrations, and all of a sudden the SaaS platform is completely out of compliance. So after it's gone through its entire, vendor risk assessment process, once it's in the hands of the users, it becomes essentially out of compliance, not because the users are trying to be, malicious. They're just trying to use tools that are beneficial, and tools that essentially haven't been validated by the organization. And so there's so many times where a tool will get introduced, for something that's confidential or something that's high end, that's going to cause a problem in your organization. And then really security controls. And so, since we are on the CSA, using things like the CCM to be able to tie back the configurations on your SaaS platform to the different controls, and are they adhering to your tier, your baseline for that that level of platform. And so those are just some really important, I think, things that I've thought would be important to bring up here as things that we should think about. Any questions on that? All right. So I wanted to touch base on this Octagon model. Has anyone, I guess a show of hands, emoji hands, has anyone read or utilized the Octagon model for CSA? You can little emoji hand if you have. I don't see anyone raising a hand on that.
Hey, this is good, man. So people are learning something new here today.
Yeah. So yeah, now I feel special about this.
Good job.
So the Octagon model is something that the CSA introduced, I think maybe about a year ago. Don't quote me on that one. But essentially what they tried to do was develop a methodology for risk assessments. And really what they looked at is creating like a multidisciplined view to be able to look at risk of a platform being introduced into the organization. And so, the amount of things that you can kind of cover in that model, from architecture to IT governance to procurement. Some of the things tie back to the points that I had in the last slide, really, help you kind of reduce that risk in significant ways. So just as you would have kind of a cross-functional team in your cloud DevOps model, having a cross-functional team in that risk assessment is really going to be critical. And critical, as I mentioned before, having the cloud-based expert reviewing that infrastructure to ensure that that's going to be, a platform that is going to operate in your organization in a very secure and compliant way. You can download that at CSA. I'm sure y'all know the URL. So SaaS security posture management, which is really around all the different things that SaaS has, is such an important piece, and it's really kind of a growing piece in the sphere, right? You have all different types of tools that are being introduced, and really to try to address the question of what is the health of my overall SaaS portfolio, right? Am I able to look at a few things like, if I have someone that is a threat actor across multiple SaaS platforms, can I essentially see that, or can I see the utilization of SaaS out there, or can I see what are the sanctioned and unsanctioned platforms that are out there? And so a lot of tools are starting to kind of come out of the woodwork. I would say in the last year and a half, they're starting to get more mature. A lot of SaaS providers that are on the enterprise side are starting to adapt APIs to allow these service providers to be included. I mean, things like Zoom, what is the SaaS security posture management of Zoom? They, because they were so, I guess, high level during the pandemic, having that management plane so important so that you can make sure that you are being able to watch this, the security of that on an active basis in real time. And so, there's a couple things to look at, right? One is health, as I mentioned before, being able to see what is the current status of my SaaS-based applications. Are they all running good? Has the SaaS vendor been validated by other organizations, to ensure that, they haven't had a breach or they're up? Identity and access management, such an important piece in cloud, right? Identity is the next perimeter, is something that is said constantly in cloud. And in SaaS, it's what drives access to the platform, right? Identity is the most powerful thing. I mean, you look at Salesforce or ServiceNow or even Workday. Your identity can pretty much change a lot of different things. We had a scenario where somebody was able to get a higher access identity to an Oracle HSM system and change everyone's bank account before payday. And so 3,000 employees weren't getting paid because someone was able to access and change that account. And so having access of who has, being able to manage that identity is such an important thing, which is, tied to monitoring and alerting. So having a centralized, just like you would with a SEM, but really on the SaaS side, which is trying to give you a little bit more information that's SaaS specific, right? integrated into your system. And really authorized use. And authorized use isn't necessarily an identity, but authorized use meaning like, is this SaaS platform available for my organization? And more specifically, is the instance of this SaaS platform available for my organization? And so you're seeing a lot of things that are available out there in different platforms that are kind of addressing these needs. And like I said, a lot of them are starting to become way more mature, where they're starting to really address the security needs of an organization. Any questions before I move on?
Nope, you're doing good. Good stuff.
All right. Yeah, so here's some use cases. Unauthorized instance. And so I use Dropbox as an example, but essentially you may have a scenario where you have an authorized instance of Dropbox, but one of the employees is using an unauthorized instance. And so being able to determine, what is that access, and how can I restrict access? Maybe I can introduce access. We're working with a partner and I want to introduce access to another instance of Dropbox because I know they're authorized. But how do I reduce that? And so this is a really good example of that. Across platform activity. So a lot of these SSPMs are starting to look at anomalies. Let's say they're getting someone to access all these different platforms and doing mass downloads of information, and so being able to trail that between three different multiple platforms, I think, is really important. And so different platforms are starting to kind of give notifications and genericize those notifications. So essentially, if you have Splunk or something, and you have all these different platforms in place, sometimes it's hard to kind of determine, how is this happening across platforms. But, this essentially will genericize the type of data that's coming in and say, okay, this was a login across this platform with this one particular person. And the reason we know is because, maybe the email address of the username is tied in the back end to all of that. And so it's really nice to kind of have that viewpoint if you need to respond to an incident right away. And usage, this isn't necessarily a security thing, but it potentially can be, right? There's a couple platforms out there that will tell you, let's say you're using Dropbox and Google Drive, and 40% of your organization's using Google Drive, 20% of your organization's using Box, and only 5% of your organization's using Dropbox. But you have, the same number of licenses for your entire organization. So you have 5,000 licenses of each of those platforms. And so there's a couple platforms that are out there that'll be able to look at usage and determine, is your organization having any overlap in SaaS? And can you kind of combine or retrofit the multiple platforms down to one, or reduce the number of licenses because the usage is not there? Or from a security perspective, if you have a spike in usage, right? All of a sudden, Box went from 1,000 users to 3,000. Well, why did that happen? And so it allows you to kind of perform a little bit further investigation to look at, what's worth it and what's not. So I'll wrap with a couple tales from the trenches. I always think this is fun because one of them is really embarrassing because I'm involved in it. But the other ones are just good stories. Well, I'll say I wasn't necessarily involved totally in this one, but it came from my team, so it's a little embarrassing. We at GSA were using Slack, and so Slack is a great tool that's out there if you haven't used it for communication, where essentially the team had just started using it and it was going great. One instance, somebody wanted to share a Google Doc, and so they copy and paste the URL from the Google Doc into the Slack message, and an alert popped up, and it said, "Hey, I see that you're using Google Docs. Would you want to integrate with Slack so that you can find Google Docs faster?" Sounds like a great message, right? Yeah, I'm a user. Hey, yeah, I would love to have Google Docs find faster information from my Slack. So they hit yes. And what happened in the background is that Slack started indexing the Google Doc information of anyone who had a Slack account and a Gmail account. And it started indexing that information in an unencrypted, publicly accessible data set. And so this is the federal government. Somebody caught eye of that and basically told us to stop using it. And I'll just say now, don't start texting your people to stop using Slack because they fixed this issue. But they fixed this issue because of us. They had 3 days to fix it, and they did. So that was great. But it's a good lesson learned, right? This is an application that is gone through FedRAMP, so that's not an easy process. It introduced new features and functionality that made it past FedRAMP, and this type of use case essentially was never really thought of. And because of this use case, it introduced something. Now, thankfully, no one utilized that information. But there's been other instances. I don't know if you're familiar with the China hack that happened in the federal government, like other instances where public unencrypted backups or data sets are being kind of taken advantage of. And so, having this happen at the federal level is a pretty big deal. And so being able to address it was really important. What's in the box? If people know my reference. We were doing an audit of Google Drive instance for an organization that had implemented Google Apps before it was Google Workspaces into their organization many years ago. So it had been maybe 8 years that this application that had been around and was operating all their email and documents. And they had never performed a security audit. And they were forced by one of their clients to be able to perform and see how well their security was on a bunch of different platforms, specifically how they were sharing information in Google. And so what we did is we wrote a script to be able to determine what the shared files were. And there's a couple of things that I think are really interesting. One is being able to look at who in your organization is sharing files out and who they're sharing to. So we found an engineer who had shared the entire infrastructure and data set of that organization's application, production level application, to his own personal Gmail. And so obviously that became an incident response situation. People had to address it. But I think another thing that was really important was that a lot of organizations were sharing documents to that organization. And some of the titles appeared that information was very sensitive. And so having to kind of walk back to say, we not only did we have to manage, what was happening in our house, we had to manage who people in our house were talking to and were sharing data to. And we may not necessarily had access to that information, but we had to be a little bit more specific once we kind of saw the patterns of how we, essentially approve or unapprove organizations sharing to our audience. Because somebody has one Google Doc open, they can copy and paste to another Google Doc, right? And this is the importance of the tenant security, right? Not only do I have access to my corporate Dropbox, but I have access to someone else's. It's not that hard to copy and paste a file over. So being able to manage that is really important. And then add-on bonanza. We had a vendor of ours. They do Salesforce security audits and on the software, on the SSPM side. And so they had shared with us a story. This is actually not a story from our organization, but they shared with us that they had installed a brand new version of Salesforce, and they ran through and did all the security configurations that they could in the organization, and they ran their health check platform on it, and it cleared. And so they moved it to production. But one thing that they didn't do was turn off the add-on capability for Salesforce. And so in 48 hours, the amount of applications that had been added to the organization was in the 400s, and had completely broken many of the security and compliance requirements that organization had put on in the first place. And so just by allowing it to run open in the wild, it introduced all different types of potential security vulnerabilities just by adding on to that application. So those are a couple stories that I wanted to share. I don't know if anybody has any other questions or comments around that, or questions around SaaS in general. Happy to answer.
Come on, one question. All right, Rob, ask one of the questions from the list. All right, so Rob won't do that either.
Well, I had to find the button. I'm not doing well on buttons tonight. Stand by. I wrote down some questions beforehand.
Oh, no worries. Oh, I'm also speaking to you from Europe. I'm in the Netherlands, so a little extra special treat. It's 11 p.m. here.
Man, I thought you were in Milwaukee.
Oh, I live in Milwaukee. I'm just here visiting family.
I got a couple questions I wrote down here for you. What are some of the best ways to manage tenant configurations?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. It's complicated, right? Because there's so many different SaaS platforms out there. How do you kind of create a baseline for the tenant configurations? So one of the exercises that we did at GuidePoint was kind of go through the different security control frameworks that are out there and try to implement some generic security control questions, like role-based access. Like, does your identity platform does your platform have a role-based access with its identity? And if it does, that essentially allows you to investigate, what type of roles are you given? Are they already preset? Can you make custom roles? If you can make a custom role, what type of configurations you can ask. So just having that little piece of information with the exercise that we went through allows us to kind of dig deep a little bit further. And so that's good from like a management of that one platform, but managing the overall platform, implementing this stuff in a document management system to be able to kind of reference when you need to. There's a couple like SaaS management based platforms that will allow you to kind of store all this stuff, and will also kind of tell you the health of the SaaS based application from the vendor side as they do audits, and if they hear anything that breaches, they'll notify. But having kind of one place to manage it is really important.
Excellent, thank you. I actually got another one that was sent to me. How do I know if a SaaS tool is being utilized?
So depending on the platform, a lot of platforms will have the administration section tell you the last time someone's logged into it. For example, with Slack, you can determine through the admin how many people have logged in and what was the latest activity. You can do the same thing in Zoom and Salesforce. So that's become a more common feature. So I would use that as your purview into that, or using one of the SSPMs that are out there to be able to look at, or CASB to see, is this platform accessed through our system or not.
Excellent. And I actually got this question from my sales engineer. I really like this one. What type of questions should I be asking a SaaS vendor?
I would be asking them cloud specific questions. One that we always ask is, how is the tenancy organized? Is it, are they separate or are they integrated? One example is a law firm. So we were working with a law firm, and there's a thing called blind subpoenas. And so if an organization or a SaaS vendor gets a blind subpoena, essentially, and they have access to the keys, it exposes the data for everyone in the platform. So having that individual data is really responsible. It's really good to have that separate. So that's a really good question to ask. The other one is that, do they follow any cloud-based security practices like CSA, or other ones that are out there, to be able to, determine how mature is their cloud program.
Actually, Ramki, I see some questions also coming in the chat. I actually have one more that was sent to me directly. If you want to do the ones in the chat first, or
I can do the ones in the chat. Do you do a full assessment when reviewing add-ons and integrations? Yes, 100%. They're essentially a different SaaS platform, right? And so doing that integration is really important. Again, based on the tier, right? If that integration is only accessing something that is not sensitive. So sometimes you may have a high platform system, but that SaaS platform is only accessing one part of the tier and you're keeping that security pretty locked down. Or that SaaS platform may, introduce some higher risk factors. So that's really due, but we technically will encourage to do a full assessment. And then under the shared responsibility, how do you manage compliance? PCI, Hipaa, for instance, how do you share compliance? How do you share the compliance requirements? So we actually are, we're actually have been dealing with this a lot. And, this is where you look at, if an organization, if a vendor has to, if they're PCI or Hipaa, they have to adhere to that, right? They have to adhere to PCI or Hipaa, and they have to show their certifications for that. And so if you can't prove it, then they're not utilizing that. And I always say, like, from a security perspective, like, get really cool with the vendor's security team. And so that way, if there's an incident, you know exactly who to talk to and exactly who to work with. It's such an important part of it.
I see one above that. I don't know if you addressed this one. How are DNS security controls typically addressed in a SaaS model?
I didn't see that one. Where is it?
It might have been sent directly to me. Yeah, it was. How are DNS security controls typically addressed in a SaaS model?
DNS security controls. I would say they're typically not, right? Like, it would be real specific, I guess. Sometimes you have organizations that will have, or I'm sorry, SaaS providers that allow you to make like a custom DNS entry, but that modification is pretty generic. Like there's not, from a security perspective, a lot of complicated things that you have to do. So yeah, so I would say maybe not as much.
Okay, and I see Jim had a question as well, if you want that one.
Well, for Fisma and Fedramp, you do need that to operate in government. And so is Figma or FedRAMP overkill? I mean, it's a lot of heavy lifting, but it's kind of necessary in a security perspective, right? I mean, the government as someone who used to be a Fed and work with the Fisma and FedRAMP team, it's a lot to go through, and it's, you know, it operates in the speed of government sometimes, where it takes years to get that through. I mean, there's FedRAMP Tailored, which is a faster program, and I would say that like they're doing a lot more to like make sure that the program is working faster and more efficiently. But I think it's important for that from a government standpoint. I mean, government agencies are really clueless on some of this stuff, and so having that authorization just makes it a little bit more secure for us as citizens and us as a country. But it's painful. It's painful.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. I got one more question for you. How can I check if the right kind of data is being placed in my SaaS vendor?
Yeah, so you can use you know, an SSPM or a CASB to be able to kind of put some rules around the type of data. You know, sometimes that can get a little bit more complicated. You can do what typically happens from what I've seen is that you do an audit with the business owner to say, okay, well, what type of data have you been putting into the system? And that will usually create the the flag. But it's really hard to kind of go into the system and kind of audit the data. You could work with the SaaS vendor to be able to do that depending on the level that you're in, or help with the SaaS vendor. We've seen where the SaaS vendor will implement controls on their side to be able to watch the data for you, depending on your relationship. You know, SaaS vendors will do a lot to get into big organizations. And so sometimes they'll rewrite code and get things positioned. That's something that we've seen over and over again, a SaaS vendor being able to adjust as needed to get there. So don't be afraid to ask as an addition to that question.
Yeah, these are all great questions. Any other questions?
Yeah, I actually have one question here in my office from Tom Karan.
Yeah, so I know you talked a little bit about SOC 2 and how, you know, be wary. I know one of the things that we see a lot is we ask a cloud provider to provide a SOC 2 just as a, you know, get that, at least they're being audited type of thing. But a lot of times we're seeing that they're just sending us the AWS or the Azure or whatever. They're not actually providing us a SOC 2 for them. What are some things that you've done with cloud providers on that, of, you know, getting where they don't have a SOC 2, or you just can't, you know, it's somebody in Europe or something? What are some of the strategies you've used in the past to get?
Well, that's where we start
confidence?
asking questions, right? We start asking questions about their architecture. You know, how do they handle S3 buckets, or like if they're using serverless, you know, what type of security are they implementing for their serverless infrastructure? You know, are they using multi-account architecture for their application? You know, we start really digging into asking questions about their architecture, and 9 times out of 10, those questions really, you know, they answer the question that they understand or they don't. You know, it's just like interviewing someone for the cloud, right? If you have your cloud person asking the right questions, they're going to find out real quick if that person knows or doesn't.
Yeah, I guess in terms of you're not getting that independent assurance from them. Any thoughts on how much what are some triggers or some things that you would think of to make sure that they're not just giving you the answer you want to hear, and that they're being honest about, you can send them security assessments, and they're only going to they're going to say yes to a lot of things. I mean, how do you get comfortable that their inquiry only is giving you a good assurance?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's a trust but verify, right? Like, okay, we'll have this third party, which is something we do. I think half my time is like helping SaaS security organizations get their SaaS program together, and the other half is validating SaaS vendors for organizations. So getting that third party perspective is so critical because, or if your team can kind of go in there and do a SaaS security audit, a cloud security audit of their infrastructure, even better, running some type of tool to be able to validate it, or just asking very specific questions around it, looking at screen sharing for some of that stuff as well. If it looks fishy and it doesn't feel good, like investigate a little further, and don't be afraid to like ask and dig a little deeper.
All right, good. Now this has been awesome. You're a marathon man over there. I had no idea that you could make it past 6 o'clock. You've definitely stretched that out. So good job with that. I know it's late where you're at. So
oh no, this is great. Thank you so much.
I think we'll pass it over to Eric. Mr. Eric Willie, are you out there?
I am indeed. So as we've mentioned in the past, that the CSA membership is the easiest in the game. Join us on LinkedIn. Our goal is to connect with all of our members there, and hopefully we're looking forward to at some point starting to start more conversations on there. Feel free to chime in, and if you have any questions, keep them coming on there, and we'll see if we can't spark some more communication around the various cloud topics and performing, making sure that we're in this together. For CPE credits, please feel free to reach out to Renew, and she will get you all set up for those. And then the $25 gift card giveaway. Stay tuned. All right. So
I do have the names, Eric.
Perfect. Then I will hand off to Joanne. Thank you.
So we are very lucky. We have 3 college students attending with us today. So all 3 of them will get the Amazon gift card. I have Akash Ahuja. I have Jason Jen and Z Noor. Congratulations.
There's one caveat to those gift cards, so you have to show up next month with a guest. I'm just kidding, but we would appreciate if you come back next month with a guest.
But are you really kidding, Earl?
I'm fake kidding. I'm kidding about my kidding.
I do have 3 also members. Is it 5 or 3, Eric? I'm sorry. I do have the randomizer, so it's whatever you tell me.
5 total.
5 in total. So I have 2 more members to give, and they are Chris Muncy, I believe. If I said this wrong, please forgive me. And I have also Aaron Lower. Congratulations to Chris and Aaron.
Awesome.
Right.
Congratulations.
To attend a CSA event.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. We're very happy you're here.
Yeah, you guys made more money than Romkey did. He talked for an hour.
Great
from a remote location. Yeah. Thank you to everybody for joining. I thought this was a great conversation, especially thanks to Romkey and GuidePoint for sponsoring this. I thought this was great. It's always good to have that practical experience and sharing that with the membership. So greatly appreciate you taking the time so late at night over there, and appreciate everybody joining. and we'll see you next Tuesday.
All
Tuesday
right.
next month.
Not
Thank you.
Exactly. Remember, the first Tuesday of the month.
First
is
Tuesday.
CSA Tuesday. All right.
Thank you,
Have a good
everybody.
night.
Have a good
Have an
month.
amazing evening.
Thanks.
Both seats.